The House will come to order. Calendar for the day. The first bill on the calendar for the day is House File 3. The clerk will report the bill.
House File number 3, number 1 on the calendar for the day, an act relating to transportation, the third engrossment.
Recognize the member from Hennepin, Representative Smith, to introduce your bill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, House File 3, Real ID. This bill addresses Minnesota's compliance with the Federal ID Act of 2005. It directs the Department of Public Safety to fully comply with Real ID, thus allowing us to avoid the deadline of January 2018. This bill offers a two-tier system. You can opt into the Real ID license, or you can opt into your current license that you have today. Thank you.
There is an amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment.
Nash moves to amend House File number 3, the third engrossment, as follows, and the amendment is coded A17-0073.
Recognize the member from Carver, Representative Nash, to introduce your amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, this amendment is a very simple and straightforward amendment. We talked about it before. There have been concerns in the past that some of the gun owner information would be entered into the Real ID database. And, you know, members, I had a lot of confidence that that would never happen until I saw some bill introductions from some members today about attaching gun ownership to vehicles and things like that. But members, there's going to be a handout sent out to your desk. This is very simple. It says that the commissioner is prohibited from sharing data pertaining to the purchase or transfer of firearms, application for permits for carry firearms, the purchase of firearms, ammunition, and members, it just strengthens the rights of gun owners in the state of Minnesota from having that information entered into the Real ID database. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Discussion on the Nash amendment.
Mr. Speaker, I forgot. I would request a roll call.
Roll call has been requested. Seeing 15 hands, there will be a roll call. Discussion on the A17 amendment. Seeing no discussion, the clerk will take the roll on the amendment. Clerk will close the roll. There being 85 ayes and 45 nays, the amendment is, the motion prevails and the amendment is adopted. There is another amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment.
Hansen moves to amend House File number 3, the third engrossment, as amended. The amendment is coded A14.
Recognize the member from Dakota, Representative Hansen, to introduce your amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And members, I would actually ask folks to take a look at the bill on page 21, and there's a prohibition on imposing fees or surcharges in the bill. My amendment would pay for the bill with general fund dollars. And I don't know if members are aware there were two fiscal notes for this bill. The first was on January 21st, and that fiscal note had a cost of $25 million. There was a second fiscal note that came on January 31st of $34 million with an indication that there would be an increase of 29 full-time equivalents. 29 FTEs would be added with the bill, but the bill doesn't pay for those. The bill does not pay for those FTEs. It makes the agency eat those costs, $34 million that we know of. My understanding there may be a local impact as well. So I'm asking for support for the A14 amendment.
Mr. Speaker.
The member from Sherburne, Representative Knobloch.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to a point of order under Rule 4.05, and I'm prepared to offer advice.
Representative Knobloch rises to a point of order under Rule, was it 4.05?
Yes, sir.
State your advice.
Well, Mr. Speaker, 4.05 says that an amendment is out of order if it would increase spending or the spending base from appropriations that are in this bill before we've adopted a budget resolution. And if you look at the Hansen amendment underneath page 1, line 8, it clearly anticipates taking money from the general fund, and so it is out of order. I would add, Mr. Speaker, that we both reviewed this in Ways and Means, and there was an additional fiscal note that came out afterwards, and I've talked to Mr. Marks and looked at numbers myself, and I'm satisfied that there is the funding in the driver and vehicle services account to take care of this through this biennium. But that's sort of just an addendum, Mr. Speaker. This is clearly out of order because it takes general fund money.
Representative Hansen, further advice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Knobloch is correct. This does take general fund. The rule is clear about general fund. However, I want to make sure that the members are clear what they're doing here. And the budget chair indicated that he talked with somebody about something that said somebody was okay with this. We only have the fiscal note to consider here. That's what we have in front of us. That's the fact of $34 million, 29 additional full-time equivalents eating this out of the existing funds. So, Mr. Speaker, I agree with Representative Knobloch. I would happily withdraw if I'm not ruled against that way. I would like to withdraw.
Representative Hansen withdraws the, I think it was the A17 amendment. A14 amendment, I'm sorry, thank you. There is another amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment.
Mariani moves to amend House File Number 3, the third engrossment as amended, and the amendment is coded DE1.
Recognize the member from Ramsey, Representative Mariani, to introduce your amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. And before I forget, I'd like a roll call on this amendment.
Roll call has been requested. Seeing 15 hands, there will be a roll call. Representative Mariani.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, this amendment is our chance to have a clean vote on the Real ID bill. The bill before you has actually vastly improved from where the majority caucus began last year, where there wasn't a dual option before us. I'll talk a little bit about that in a few minutes. So I'm really glad that there are members of this body who understand the importance of having that dual option framework. Unfortunately, and perhaps tragically, this bill, however, gets cluttered up with immigration issues that are totally unnecessary for us to have a Real ID compliant legislation. It has an unnecessary ban on undocumented immigrants to access a driver's license. They currently can't do that anyway because of a rule that's been in place for well over a dozen years. So members, this is really the get it done amendment. This is the don't hold the ability of individuals to be able to board airplanes and visit their loved ones at military bases hostage to a contentious, unresolved, and highly, in these days, volatile set of issues related to immigrants. Members, I want you to think about what the purpose of a driver's license is about and what it's always been about. It's about public safety. It's about public safety. And we have for generations said that public safety in regards to driver's license means that we want individuals who can experience, who can demonstrate to us that they have the maturity, the experience, the knowledge to safely conduct vehicles on our public roads. We also use them as a way to validate that said individuals are responsible in making sure that they and their vehicles are insured. So that if accidents happen, that's covered and some innocent doesn't wind up having to pay the price for someone else's mistake. The other purpose is so that we know who is driving on our public roads. Your picture is on a driver's license, your name is on a driver's license, your date of birth is on a driver's license, your address is on the driver's license. And then of course in this digital age, there's all sorts of other data and information that is also captured on your driver's license. But the bottom line is, if I'm a police officer or a county sheriff and I pull you over for speeding or whatever, you hand me your driver's license, I know who you are. I know where you live. I can hold you accountable for whatever grievance you've committed for the public. Those are really simple core principles that have held steady and true for generations, as long as we've had motorized vehicles in our society. And members, it's always been the prerogative and indeed the duty of each individual state to issue driver's licenses and to create those principles and those conditions under which an individual would have access to a driver's license. Minnesota never had an exclusionary framework or practice other than you're just not a safe driver, or you're a violent criminal or those kind of things. We've never had an exclusion based on the citizenship of the individual applying for permission, seeking permission to get a driver's license. That makes sense, really, when you think about, what an incredibly immigrant state we have been and continue to be. And it also makes sense because, again, the focus was on safely conducting a vehicle on our public roads. That has always been the focus of every single of our 50 states and territories in regards to the driver's license. Well, a few years ago, the U.S. federal government stepped into that. They stepped into that. They stepped into our prerogative, our duty, our responsibility that we were meeting quite well, and said, you're going to have to issue a driver's license that conform to what we in Washington, D.C. think is the most important thing. And I was in this body at that time, and some of you, a number of you were here with me, and we obviously chafed under that. We thought we were doing a good job of keeping our roads safe. There were a lot of questions that were raised about the kind of conditions that the federal government was now putting on us, particularly in terms of access to data. I watched some of the committee hearings here this year. I know that Representative Hertas and Wetland and others have expressed that continued concern of a federal government outside of our state demanding that our license conform with their expectations of mining data on our citizens. 10 years ago, as a result, I authored, it's a little longer than 10 years ago, Minnesota's Real ID opt-out bill. That was unanimously passed in this body, and it was passed in the Senate with only one dissenting vote. Senator Limmer, who's still in that body, was my co-author in the Senate. And it had to do with Minnesota saying we're not going to have the federal government take over our driver's license, and we're going to continue to focus on public safety on our roads. And we have a lot of questions about what kind of information you want. And I suspect that's partly why Representative Nash offered the amendment that he did earlier. But meanwhile, several things have happened. Chief among those is that our driver's license and the process of getting it, what it physically looks like, its safety precautions, the information gathered, it's all been modernized. We meet virtually every standard that the federal government has set for a secure driver's license, except one or two, and one of them has to do with this open-ended data sharing. But our driver's license is as secure as any other driver's license across the nation. The other thing the federal government did is they negotiated with states, with blue states and with red states, to create what Representative Smith has wisely embedded in his bill, which is a dual option approach for a driver's license. You don't want a Real ID compliant license because you don't want your data shared. You can get a non-compliant driver's license. You do understand you're not going to be able to use it to board a plane or visit a loved one at a military base or enter certain federal facilities, but you're willing to do that. Also, states know that we have a diversity of residents and citizens that move through all sorts of statuses. You know, think of visiting doctors from other nations who are here for short periods of time and then get caught up in the bureaucracy of DC, and all of a sudden they're kind of in limbo, but they're going to get re-recognized, but in the meantime, they actually may not be here lawfully, only because of a bureaucratic miscue on the part of Homeland Security. It happens a lot. So because of that, a number of states said, let's do that other option so we can maintain that integrity so that we keep things working in our state and we keep our public roads safe. But this bill, members, with its ban in the undocumented focus on documented immigrants and its ban on the non-compliant section, goes out of its way to exclude those immigrants from access with no justification on how that makes our roads safe. None. We don't need the peace of mind of Minnesotans to be held hostage to our unresolved anxieties and issues regarding immigrants. Representative Smith, I was going to ask you to yield, but I'm not going to do that because I know I'm kind of dragging a little bit and I've got a few things to say. You can rise up and object if I'm stating this incorrectly, but here it is. The language banning undocumented that you have in the non-compliant Real ID is not necessary for us to have a compliant agreement with the federal government. We don't need that. It's not needed. It's just a barrier. It just gets in the way. It's not needed. What this amendment does, it takes that language out. We vote for it. We have what's called a clean Real ID bill, compliant Real ID bill. Governor signs it, and he will sign that. And your constituents can use those licenses to board planes, visit military bases where their loved ones are at, and enter other federal facilities. Members, it really is that simple. I get it for many of my libertarian friends. There's always going to be those data issues. But apparently, on your side of the aisle, you've reconciled yourself to that, and you've accepted that. I think there are things to be of concern there, but we're going to have that dual option available. You don't need to do this ban to have a compliance with the federal government relative to Real ID. But members, this issue, so the argument is you don't need it. You don't need to hold hostage our ability to move forward with this immigration issue. But I'm going to go a little bit further because you have put that immigration issue on the table. And frankly, there's a far more responsible way to put that issue on the table. And it's just not right for us to do it in this way. The bottom line, members, is that that kind of language ultimately is the kind of language that leads to further divisions in our society and frankly makes us weaker. Not just weaker socially, psychologically, culturally, even spiritually, although I think it does. It makes us also weaker economically. Because of that, this bill really should have traveled to a number of committees. It easily should have traveled to the Ag Committee, to the Jobs Committee, arguably to the Health Committee, and to the Education Committee because of the presence of immigrants as workers, as students, as patients, as providers, in all of those big sectors of our society. But this bill didn't wander into those committees. They should have. That's the responsible conversation we need to be having. That's the responsible conversation the people of Minnesota expect of all of us, Republicans, Democrats, urban and rural members. The contributions of undocumented immigrants in Minnesota has been increasingly well quantified and captured in numerous studies going back easily 10 years in our state. They play a vital role in Minnesota's economy. Right now, well, as of 2012 was the latest data I had, they comprise 2.5% of our state's workforce. That's around 75,000 people. Those workers paid $87 million in state and local taxes in 2012. If we were to remove them from our state, we would lose $4.4 billion in economic activity, $4.4 billion. There's $2 billion in gross state product that's produced by these immigrant communities. Minnesota industries depend on immigrant workers. It's as plain and simple as that. And any growth that we're going to have going into the next generation is going to be heavily dependent on immigrant realities. This is especially true in our crop farming sector, our animal processing, growing and processing sector. Last week in ag policy, where I'm learning a lot, and I sit as a member, we heard from the dairy producers, the milk producers. And they told us that that industry alone is a $10.8 billion a year industry. $10.8 billion, members. Oh, and by the way, it's increasingly dependent on exports. And the number one importer of Minnesota dairy, Mexico. They employ over 31,000 workers in that sector. It generates $2 billion in labor income. The president, brand new guy, president of the Milk Producers Association, said last week in our House Ag Committee that immigrant labor is vital and we need immigration reform to keep driving this industry. We're not going to get to those kind of solutions with this kind of legislation, with exclusionary legislation that doesn't enter fully into what its impacts could be and what its messages are for an important labor force in our society. Anyone who works with Latino communities knows that there is little separation between natural-born citizens, documented residents, and undocumented residents in those communities. And that's largely what we're talking about when it comes to the undocumented folks in this bill. That intimacy of status exists in social institutions, it exists in churches, it exists in businesses, and even at the family level. My brother-in-law was undocumented. He worked, he paid taxes, he strengthened my community, he strengthened my family while he was undocumented. He's now a citizen who works, pays taxes, strengthens my community, and strengthens my family. He's co-raised a beautiful young woman born here in the States and worked hard and put her through college. And guess what? She works, she pays taxes, she strengthens my community, and she strengthens my family. This is how it works. This is how Latino America works. This is how Latino Minnesota works. It's how it's always worked. In 2014, the purchasing power of Latinos in Minnesota totaled $5.7 billion. In 2013, Latino in Minnesota paid $567 million in federal taxes. This is just one immigrant group. And $309 million in state and local taxes. Foreign-born Latinos in that group paid $250 million in federal taxes and $161 million in state local taxes. This is important. It's important for our state, not just for that community. It's important it's the mutuality of success and hard work and inclusionary policies and laws. Immigrants support the agricultural workforce and help revitalize dying rural towns. Many of my rural colleagues know this is true. The growth of immigrants in rural regions in Minnesota has been a significant factor in keeping schools open instead of consolidating or shutting down. Immigrants will continue to be an important element to our state's success. And on top of that, undocumented immigrants are not eligible for most of the public supports and largesse that we make available for other folks. So because of all this, states as red as Utah and as blue as California, and I've interacted with both of those colleagues, the governor of Utah, Senate Majority Leader of Utah, who look at me and say, you ought to do this, you ought to provide access to driver's license because it's all about your prosperity for your undocumented immigrants. You're not the federal government, Carlos. Do this. Make sure your state stays strong. Public safety across our state has increasingly lined up in support of that kind of effort. Ramsey, Hennepin County, Winona County, Red Wing Mayor and City Council, the Lakeview Police Department, the Wilmer Police Department, the Woodbury Police Department, the Minneapolis Police Department, all of them have urged us to provide that kind of access that's being denied in the language before you right now. So let me close by saying this. I'm offering an amendment here that doesn't resolve the issue of undocumented immigrants in Minnesota. There is a rule. There's nothing in this language that's going to change the rule. And so that denial of a license will continue, but it'll continue in rule, which means we'll have an opportunity, a fuller opportunity to address this issue in a meaningful way, not just by the executive branch acting unilaterally, but by us acting as the representatives of the people of Minnesota and having those conversations with that information and more that I shared with you a few minutes ago. And I offer it in these times, and I don't have to get super political about the national conversation and what's transpired in the last few weeks. Suffice it to say, the tension levels in our society have, in recent weeks, gotten higher, heavier, and much more stressful because of actions coming out of Washington, D.C. It's had a direct impact on many of our constituents here. We don't need to add to that. We can do a Minnesota way of having an intelligent conversation, smart conversation, a compassionate conversation about our policies in relationship to immigrant communities. So members, vote to give yourself the space to do that. Vote for this amendment. Come back to this issue. There have been some members on the other side of the aisle who have offered language and legislation to provide access to those driver's license. Obviously, members here, the Senate acted on this a while ago. Let's have that full, deep conversation. Let's not do this, and let's not hold hostage our citizen constituents who just simply want us to get the job done. There's a simple way to do that. Don't set up this interminable fight with the Senate, which, by the way, does not have this language. Don't set up this fight with the governor, who doesn't want this language. What we all want is to be able to provide that access for travel to federal facilities, to military bases, for our residents. There's a simple way to do that. You can do that by adopting this amendment and passing a bill forward that will probably get signed very, very quickly. So members, with that, I ask for your support. Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members.
Recognize the member from Hennepin, Representative Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, I agree with the representative that we need to have a full and deep conversation, as the representative so eloquently stated, but it needs to be in a separate bill. This bill is dealing with Real ID and exclusively Real ID, and for that reason, I ask for a no vote on this amendment. Thank you.
Recognize the member from Hennepin, Representative Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, I'll start maybe by just responding to that very last comment, which is we do have a separate bill. It was introduced earlier, House File 541, which would allow us, it's my bill, would allow us to debate the issue of driver's licenses. So we do have that. That's available. Just give me a hearing on it. We'll have a chance to vote on it. As was pointed out very well by Representative Mariani, we don't need to be messing with that and do that ban in this bill to have compliance with Real ID. And his bill brings us forward, compliance with Real ID, but it takes out what feels like a kind of well, let's just say it's extra, and it sends a very difficult message to a major portion of our labor force who Minnesota depends on. And I'm just rising to talk about that because I think Representative Mariani did such a great job of explaining a lot of the parts that are at stake here. So I handed out a couple of documents to you. One is from a place called businessnorth.com, and it says, new data on Minnesota shows economic impact of immigrant population. And what's pointed out here by none other than Bill Blazer, the Minnesota Chamber of Commerce Senior Vice President, says the research underscores once again that we must welcome immigrants if Minnesota's economy is to continue to develop and grow. This new research proves what we've known for years, that immigrants are a boon to our state's economy. So, Mr. Chairman, members, this information we've been hearing now for a couple of years. Both Representative Mariani and I put out the Minnesota Business Immigration Coalition's letter that was distributed before when we had this debate on the floor about the driver's license bill. And it's signed by, the Minnesota Agri-Growth Council, the Minnesota Chamber of Commerce, Midwest Food Processors Association, Minnesota Nursery and Landscape Association, Minnesota Milk Producers Association, Minnesota Lodging Association, and Minnesota Restaurant Associations. I've had a chance to talk with those people when they had their day on the Hill, when they came to visit. These farm industries and these landscape industries and food processing industries want us to consider separately, just as you said, Representative Smith, they want us to consider separately the issue of Minnesota driver's license. Don't throw it in here to send a really unwelcoming message to so many of their workers. They need those undocumented workers to do their job, to do that industry. It's very clear. I'm sure you know that. We've been told it in numerous ways. There's another document I passed out, which was the Star Tribune's editorial board in January. They talked about the Real ID, the need for Real ID, and they also said, for reasons of public safety, we favor issuing licenses to all drivers, as do many of this state's law enforcement officials. And that is not a question, they say, that should be answered in connection with Real ID. Legislators should send a clean bipartisan bill to Dayton's desk ASAP. So I'm just adding what Representative Mariani said, and I'm hoping if you look at these documents and you see how much Minnesota's rural economy, and I would say our city economy in many places too, but this is specifically pointing out how our rural economy really needs to send a welcoming, not a condemning message through this bill. One of the things that struck me, I grew up in rural Minnesota, small consolidated school, and one of the parts of the legislation that's written there in that one letter is that immigrants support the agricultural workforce and help revitalize dying rural towns. Additionally, the influx of immigrants in rural regions of Minnesota has been a significant factor in keeping schools open instead of consolidating. I just think we need to remember that, and we need to support those folks. And I'm hoping that today we will send a welcoming message, we'll send a supportive message to our rural agriculture industries, and that we will have our separate discussion as we can around House File 541. So Representative Smith, I really ask for your support in this piece of legislation. It's just smart, it's caring, and I think it helps move Minnesota forward, not backward. Thank you.
The member from Ramsey, Representative Pinto.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, I want to go back to the statement of my colleague and friend, Representative Smith, just a bit earlier. As I understood what he was saying in response to Representative Mariani, he said this issue of immigration is a separate one. It should be dealt with separately. We should do something simple and clean. This bill is focused on Real ID. So let's just make sure we're focused on this here. So, and doing the math. Representative Mariani's amendment plus an immigration provision that the Minnesota Catholic Conference calls unnecessary for the legislative intent of the Real ID bill equals the Smith bill, okay? The amendment says we take away this immigration language that the Star Tribune calls a controversial question that need not be answered in connection with Real ID. Vote for the Mariani amendment. We take away this controversial, unnecessary point, and thank you, Representative Smith, for making that point. We take that away, and we're left with a simple, clean bill on the thing we all agree, thank you, Representative Smith, we all agree should happen, which is Real ID. What happens now with this is we've got a bill, Representative Smith's bill, that adds this unnecessary controversial provision. So that's what's happening here. If you vote yes, you're voting to say, hey, let's focus on Real ID. Let's not clutter it up with something that is, to quote the Catholic Conference, unnecessary, to quote the Star Tribune, controversial. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Further discussion on the amendment. The member from Nicollet, Representative Johnson C.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I rise in support of the DE1 amendment. And what Representative Clark described as the situation in southern Minnesota is basically sums up my experience having lived there for the last 34 years. Over that time, I've seen southern Minnesota change quite a bit, as many people have immigrated to that section of the state. And the immigrants have become a really deep part of our fabric of so many communities across southern Minnesota. But in so doing, what they have also done is really filled an important workforce shortage that we're facing in southern Minnesota, particularly in the sector of agriculture and specifically in the livestock industry. Hog barns and dairies right now are being cleaned and worked by people who have emigrated to southern Minnesota. These people are doing critical, vital work that make our agricultural sector succeed. Fundamentally, I consider this a public safety issue. I think it just makes good sense, and I think everybody in Minnesota would agree that we want everybody on the road to have a driver's license of some sort and to have auto insurance. The language that is being removed through the DE1 amendment would help us remove an obstacle to that being achieved. So let's not establish additional obstacles to achieving legal access to travel for all Minnesotans and all people living in Minnesota. Let's vote for the DE1 amendment. Thank you.
Member from Ramsey, Representative Fisher.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I also rise in support of the amendment. The community that I belong to, the faith-based community, which is down the road, 100 years ago was an immigrant community that did not speak English. Today, it is again a heavily immigrant community that does not speak English. It is our immigrant brothers and sisters that are here, working in our society, providing services for us. We need to be looking at concrete ways to bring them into our society. The amendment that we have here allows a path forward. It does not guarantee it right now because currently we have rules that need to be changed to allow it. But by taking the original underlying bill that we have, it would continue to marginalize our immigrant brothers and sisters, make them feel on the outskirts of our society when actually they're contributing strongly to us. We need to provide a way for driver's licenses for them so that they can provide the public safety needs that we need for getting from point A to point B and making them feel welcome in our society. Immigration policy is complicated and contentious. But let's not prematurely foreclose the possibility of further dialogue to change our rules that we have in our state to allow immigrants to have the opportunity for driver's licenses. The amendment we have would allow that possibility. The underlying bill does not. Please support our immigrant brothers and sisters.
Member from Hennepin, Representative Dean R.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. This is a good amendment. And it's good because it does one thing that I heard Representative Smith say early on when this bill was presented in Civil Law Committee. And that was that we need this to happen sooner rather than later. And I would just put forward that by adopting the DE amendment, taking away the, I don't know how to say it, but anti-immigrant language that's in there, we would be able to move this, and I would venture to guess within a few weeks, the governor would be able to sign it. If we don't do this DE amendment, and if the current bill moves forward with the language that's in there, you know, I think we could be looking at quite a bit of time, and it will take a while because it's certain that the other body's language may be different. And, you know, we talked about this bill last year. Same issue. If it's urgent for the residents of Minnesota to have access to a real ID, let's pass this DE amendment and let's move forward and get this in place so that our residents can have their IDs in time before they can't get on planes or get into federal buildings. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Member from Ramsey, Representative Mariani.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, members, for your comments and thoughts. I do have a question for Representative Smith. I wonder if he would yield to it.
He will yield. Representative Mariani.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Representative Smith. Representative Smith, your response to my argument, I think, might have left a number of people here confused. And I think it's really important that as we cast votes that no one is confused on what they're voting. I also think it's very important that we are as forthcoming as possible, all of us as members, about the impact of our legislation. And so I just want to give you an opportunity to have clarity at this point. It is my contention that my language delivers a real ID compliance legislation that the federal government will accept. And I think your answer kind of confused on that. So I want to ask you, just point blank, do we need the language that you have in this bill in regards to, I forget what the term is, unlawful status individuals? as it applies to the non-compliant license, let's call that license 2, do we need that language in order to have a compliant real ID legislation that will pass muster with the federal government?
Representative Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative, this language is needed for 2 reasons. Number 1, the rulemaking will be much quicker and will ensure that the Department of Public Safety will be able to implement this bill in a timely fashion. Additionally, this complex immigration policy that we're discussing, and I've appreciated the thoughtful discussion that I've had with many of you on both sides of the aisle about this issue over the last year. But that decision, that discussion needs to happen in a separate bill done by this legislature, not done by an agency. Thank you.
Representative Mariani.
Well, Mr. Speaker and Representative Smith, you and I have had some very collegial conversations over the course of the last few weeks, and I really appreciate you reaching out. You did that actually quite early last year as well. However, members, if you listen carefully to what Representative Smith just said, he didn't answer my question. And I think it's important to answer the question. And I don't even want to refute the issues that you put forward. Fine. So let me ask the question in another way, and maybe that'll help us here. Do we need the language? And it's on page 8. So this is the language in regards to undocumented immigrants as it manifests itself with the non-compliant license, not the compliant license, because Real ID is pretty clear. You got to be a citizen. But the federal government has also been real clear, but states, if you want to do a second license for those who aren't citizens, you can do that. And they've given permission to, I forget how many numbers of states, quite a few states to do that, including, again, all red states, all Republican states, led by Republicans who offered it, and all blue states led by Democrats who offered it. So my question to you, Representative Smith, is do we need the language that you have with the undocumented immigrants on the non-compliant license? Do we need that language in order for Minnesota citizens to be able to travel on airplanes with the Real ID license 1, be able to visit their loved ones on military bases and enter certain federal facilities? Do we need your exclusionary language? Do we need that in order for Minnesota citizens to be able to exercise those privileges?
He will yield. Representative Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative, we've talked about this issue, as you mentioned, several times, and I respectfully disagree with the word about exclusionary. How you get a license today and the people that can acquire licenses today are exactly the same if this bill becomes law. Exactly the same. It's not exclusionary. This language is necessary. It is needed, and there isn't any change for the people who are going to have a license today once this bill is enacted.
Representative Mariani.
Well, Mr. Speaker and Representative Smith, so I gave you 2 chances here. I don't think I'm going to give you a third one. Let me just give you some counsel, and that is that we can agree to disagree on what not the intent, what the impact of legislation is. But it's pretty clear for anyone who spent even a minute looking at the federal Real ID and the fact that several other states have created this double option without your language, precisely to provide that access to those communities. And that is okay with the federal government. That's okay with them. So you don't need this language. The evidence is overwhelming that you don't need the language. You may need it for other reasons, but those are distractionary arguments. You don't need this language in order to have a real ID compliant piece of legislation, members. Read the law, read the federal law, read our bill, read your bill. You don't need it. And it would be, quite frankly, members, a freer conversation if we were honest enough to say the reason we have this language here is because we simply don't want those people to have driver's licenses, not because it's necessary in order to have a real ID compliant legislation. So Representative Smith, my counsel to you, I wish you a long and productive presence in this body. Perhaps not as long as mine. I don't think I'd wish that on anyone. However, your ability to do that is going to be really contingent on the ability to be straightforward with your colleagues here as you ask them to cast votes here. Because each and every one of you are going to have to go back to your districts and explain why you voted for something that's not true. And Representative Smith, you mentioned that there's another bill. My understanding is it has been introduced. That's House File 541. Mr. Speaker and Madam Majority Leader, leaders of the respective committees, I would fully expect, based on Representative Smith's heartfelt argument, that we ought to be having that conversation as well, that that bill get heard as quickly as possible, and that we have a discussion about that. But you don't need to do that. You don't need to do this bill without my amendment in order to do that. So members, let's quit game playing here. Let's put a clean bill forward. Representative Dean is correct. I can't speak for the executive body. But I strongly suspect if you look at the behavior at the end of last session, if we do that, we're going to resolve this issue really quick. That's what people sent us here to do, not to play games, not to distract, not to avoid answering questions, but to do the people's work. Let's do the people's work, and let's vote positive on this amendment.
Further discussion on the DE1 amendment? Seeing no further discussion, the clerk will take the roll on the bill, or the amendment, excuse me. Clerk will close the roll. There being 57 ayes and 74 nays, the motion does not prevail and the amendment is not adopted. There are no further amendments at the desk. The clerk will give the bill its third reading.
Third reading, House File number 3, as amended.
Third reading. Discussion on House File 3. The member from Dakota, Representative Hansen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would Representative Smith yield for a question?
He will yield. Representative Hansen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Representative Smith, I know that you and Representative Knobloch have passed out a sheet with the fund balance that shows the depreciation of the Vehicle Services Fund to pay for implementation of the bill. But I wanted to have a question about the local fiscal impact. And looking at the fiscal note, it has an estimated greater than $7.5 million of loss. It talks about background investigations of $32 per person, and then a filing fee of $8 times 1.2 million applicants versus a factor of 74% to pay for that, so a 7.5 million loss. So Representative Smith, is that cost that's going to be borne by deputy registrars and local governments who are often operating on a very thin margin in terms of providing that service? It looks like the fiscal note above has a cost for the BCA for doing the background checks of the background checkers, but that's, I just need explanation of what that means.
Member from Hennepin, Representative Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative, the funds in the special revenue do cover the cost of the program. If there are some additional costs that are needed, the department can deal with that through the Transportation Committee.
Representative Hansen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Representative Smith, that really didn't answer my question, because you're talking about the balance estimates on the state costs, but it has a local fiscal impact that's there, and I'm wondering who bears that cost, because the state costs, could you help me understand that?
He will yield. Representative Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative, so those costs that you're speaking to, Representative, are dealt through the fees, and if there is going to be a shortage, the fees can be adjusted on an annual basis like they currently are done today.
Representative Hansen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, but Representative Smith, on page 21, you prevent any fee increases or additional fees, so how does that work? Is it something then that those fees are prohibited at the state level, so local units of government would have to raise the fees in order to stay open? Would Representative Smith yield?
He will yield. The member from Hennepin, Representative Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative, the deputy registrars simply just would not get the fees.
Representative Hansen.
Well, Mr. Speaker and members, and Representative Mariani, I think we're kind of in the same boat here on our series of questions. A lot of doubt raised in terms of what these things really mean and what this bill really does and what the costs are. I think that doubt raises a no vote for the bill in addition to the other questions that were raised, but a lot of concern here about what the balance actually happens with this bill. Rating funds, unanticipated costs, unclear at best. So I'm a no vote.
Member from Ramsey, Representative Pinto.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, I guess I'm feeling some frustration right now because once again we're seeing a pretty simple issue with admittedly Minnesotans are feeling urgency about that's being held hostage to an extreme ideological approach on an issue. And how extreme is this? Well, the Minnesota Chamber of Commerce, Agri-Growth Council, Minnesota Nursery and Landscape Association, a whole bunch of others have an opposite view on this extra piece. Remember, we had the Mariani Amendment, and then this extra piece that the Catholic Conference called unnecessary and the Star Tribune called controversial. And so once again, similar to unemployment insurance for minors last year, similar to the healthcare premium situation last month, where something that is simple that Minnesotans are calling for is being held hostage to something else, to another piece that has to be driven through. Minnesotans, my feeling is that that's not something that we should be accepting. I plan to vote against this bill, and I'd urge others to do so as well. Let's get this simple need met. Let's do so in a straightforward fashion. We don't need to tack on other things that are so controversial and that so many other groups, like the ones that I've mentioned, in fact, are opposed to. Thank you.
Member from Ramsey, Representative Lesh.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would Representative Backer yield to a question?
He will yield. Representative Lesh.
Thank you. Where is he?
He's in the back row.
Oh, back. There we go. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Backer, do you have any large employers in your district that hire immigrant employees?
Representative Backer.
Speaker, Representative, yes, I do.
Representative Lesh.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and Representative Backer. I'm not aware which ones those are. Would you enlighten me as to which employers those are?
Representative Backer.
Speaker and Representative, we have Riverview Dairy in Stevens County.
Representative Lesh.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would Representative Backer yield to another question?
He will yield. Representative Lesh.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Backer, have you talked to anyone at Riverview Farms to determine if they support or oppose this bill on the grounds that it's an attempt to deny undocumented immigrants the ability to apply for a legal driver's license, which may impact their ability to get to work?
Representative Backer.
Speaker and Representative, no, I have not.
Representative Lesh.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, that explains your vote on the Mariani amendment then. Do you know of any of the, Mr. Speaker, would Representative Backer yield to another question?
He will yield. Representative Lesh.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Backer, do you know of any of those employees that work at that business in your district whose ability to drive may be impacted and to get to work and support that business in your district?
Representative Backer.
Speaker and Representative, I've talked to several of the people that works for Riverview, and this has never came up in any conversation when I've been out there.
Representative Lesh.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. Would Representative Baker yield to a question?
He will yield. Representative Lesh.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Baker, do you have any businesses in your district that may have workers who are immigrants that could potentially be affected by this bill?
Member from Candy, Ohio, Representative Baker.
Mr. Speaker, yes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would Representative Baker yield to another question?
He will yield. Representative Lesh.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Baker, I'm assuming that maybe that's why you voted the way you did on the last amendment, that you have concerns over these businesses to retain employees or the workers who live in your district to get to their jobs. Is that fair to say?
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker.
One moment, please. Representative Lesh, your question is not appropriate in the chamber to ask another member how or why they voted the way they did.
Well, Mr. Speaker, thank you. I wasn't asking. I was assuming. But would Representative Baker yield another question?
He will yield. Representative Lesh.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Baker, do you know the business owner or owners of Genio or any of the businesses in your district who employ folks whose ability to drive may be impacted by this? Or do you know any of the workers whose ability to drive may be impacted by this?
Representative Baker.
Speaker and Representative, yes, I do know a number of people out in the area. They think this is a very important bill to make sure we get on airplanes and we get to military bases. And this is why this is an important bill to move forward. I look forward to wrapping this up. Thank you.
Representative Lesh.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I agree that it's a very important bill. I voted just like you did on the last amendment because I had concerns that I think probably are similar that apparently weren't persuasive enough for the body, which I think is unfortunate. Mr. Speaker, would Representative Miller yield to a question?
He will yield. Representative Lesh.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Miller, do you have any businesses in your district that employ individuals whose ability to stay employed and get to employment may be affected by this legislation?
Representative Miller.
Representative Lesh, I'm not aware of any that have come to me to talk to me about that.
Representative Lesh.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Miller, you may not be aware, but you've got a Genio in Montevideo. And the percentage of folks there whose ability to drive may be affected by this legislation is in question, but it's a substantial amount. And I wonder about the wisdom of and its effect upon the business owners and also the workers there. Mr. Speaker, would Representative Daniels yield to a question?
He will yield. Representative Lash.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Daniels, do you have any businesses in your district who employ folks whose ability to get to their jobs in a car and drive may be affected by this legislation?
I've had quite a few meetings in my district, and none that I'm aware of that getting to work and back is an issue. We've had a lot of discussion in my district about what we're talking about tonight, and well over 90% of the people I talk to are not in favor of giving illegals driver's licenses. Thank you.
Mr. Speaker,
Representative Lash.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would Representative Daniels yield to another question?
He will yield. Representative Lash.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So what I heard you say, Representative Daniels, was that you can't conceive there to be any issues with folks in your district getting to work as a result, any results of this bill. Is that what I heard you say?
Representative Daniels.
Mr. Speaker, Representative, I don't know of anybody that's having difficulty getting to work in our district, whether it be legal or legal or illegal.
Okay, Mr. Speaker, I couldn't really hear the answer. Could I ask Representative Daniels to repeat his answer?
He will yield. Representative Daniels.
Mr. Speaker, Representative, I'm sorry, I got a really bad cold, and we've had several town meetings. We talked to the people about this issue, and all I can say is probably 9 out of 10 people are not in favor of letting illegals have driver's licenses. And I'm not aware of anybody that's not getting to work because they don't have a driver's license.
Okay, Mr.
Representative
Speaker,
Lash.
thank you. When we talk to the right people, we get the answers we want, I think is what I've surmised from this conversation. But all of you know out here, the issue of immigration in the United States is an issue for both parties. Both parties are schizophrenic about this. But at issue today is the schizophrenia on your side of the aisle. Because you've got businesses that employ folks who need to get to work. And you're interfering with their ability to get to work. And you saw from some of the answers that you heard here today of folks I asked, some people get that, some people don't get it, and some people just don't want to be bothered with it. But just because you don't want to be bothered with it doesn't mean it's not going to come and bite you after it gets passed. You had a real option here to have a clean bill that the governor could sign that would not interfere with that ability of folks to get to work. And you're saying, oh, hang on a second, this is all about the legality. Would that were the major issue for every single bill that we passed in here. We'd have very different kinds of bills going through here. Everyone here understands there's a huge percentage of drivers on the road that get employed by folks, many of them in low-wage jobs. And sometimes they've driven with revoked driver's license, sometimes they've even driven without insurance, and that impacts them in the long run. There's no question about it. But the idea that you had to add this language in there as a little thumb in the eye because of immigrants, I think is deplorable. And the Catholic Conference made clear in this letter, notwithstanding the statements of Representative Smith, that this is absolutely an issue. Everyone here said the folks who've looked at this bill, considered the language, know that this is an issue. You didn't have to do it, and you did it. And those of you who do care about these people that are here, that supply the labor, that supply the food, this is food. These are meatpacking businesses. These are dairy businesses. This is where you get your food from. And when I was in high school, I went to high school in southern Wisconsin, and I went to high school with a lot of farmers. Never been a farmer, never spent a ton of time on a farm, but I did my share when I was in high school because it was a boarding high school. We went home on the weekends. And Sam Martin, who's now a priest, I remember the first time he came down to the chow hall in the basement, and he was offered a glass of milk by someone, and he said, no, I don't drink bot milk. And I didn't know what bot milk is. Does anyone here know what bot milk is? Okay. It's milk you buy at a store. So that was my first education about what it means, where food really comes from, and honestly, who produces it for us. And there's a big hands over the ears and hands over the eyes of who's producing our food here, and I think it's going to come back to haunt us. So because that amendment didn't pass, I think it's unfortunate. I'm going to be a no vote on this bill. It could have been potentially a yes, but I think it's unfortunate what happened here on the floor of the House today.
Recognize the member from Dakota, Representative Halverson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise with a lot of disappointment about the reaction to the Mariani amendment, and I also am disappointed in the debate that we're having. We're having a debate about immigration when we should be talking about Real ID. We've put this decision off as a body for far too long, and here we are again putting a decision for the people of Minnesota at risk because we are going to politicize this issue with immigration. And we've gotten a number of handouts tonight, which I think were really helpful and illuminating in terms of what people are asking for when they're asking for our support of Real ID. We've heard from the Chamber of Commerce, the United States Air Force, the National Guard, all saying pass Real ID, do it quickly. The Chamber asks us to do it in a bipartisan manner. I couldn't agree more. The people of my district are saying pass Real ID. Not a single one of these entities, not a single one of my members of my district that have contacted me have said, pass Real ID with controversial language about immigration in it. Pass Real ID in a way that puts its passage at risk in the other body. No one's asking for that. People are asking for one thing from us. One thing. Pass Real ID. Pass Real ID tonight. And here we have a bill that's going to put that at risk for the citizens of Minnesota. Shame on us. This is disappointing. We also, everyone has made it clear that talking about the issue of driver's license for people who are in this country of various statuses, immigration statuses, need to be talked about. And you know what? A lot of these same organizations that are asking us to pass Real ID have asked us to deal with that issue as well. And they have said, we support helping undocumented immigrants get driver's license for public safety purposes, for economic purposes, for work purposes. Organizations like the Chamber of Commerce, the Minnesota Milk Producers, the AgriGrowth Council. These folks agree we should be talking about this. We shouldn't be talking about this in this bill. Do Minnesotans a favor and pass Real ID. I'm sorry that I cannot vote for this bill because we are not doing what Minnesota is asking us to do tonight. We can do better. I look forward to seeing this bill come back from the Senate, and hopefully that we will take Representative Mariani's advice and we will deal with Real ID like we should for the people of Minnesota.
Member from Hennepin, Representative Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, as a reminder, this bill does not impact the current system for who can get a license and who cannot. There's been lots of discussion thus far this evening implying that this bill will restrict someone who can get a license today but cannot tomorrow. That is just simply not true. This bill does not change. If you can get a license today, you can get one once this bill becomes enacted. If you cannot get a license today, you cannot get a license once this bill is enacted.
Member from Anoka, Representative Bernardi.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I rise in opposition to this bill that's before us. Immigrants have been a major part of Minnesota's history. They're a rich part of what makes us Minnesota. They settle the land through federal subsidies that once was solely inhabited by indigenous people. They built things like our places of worship, our colleges, and they built strong communities. Today, we are faced with the need to pass legislation so that people can get a real ID to be compliant with the federal law so they can get on airplanes and they can get into federal facilities. This legislation before us is not a clean, simple, real ID bill, but rather it's messy, and it's been mucked up with an unnecessary provision into Minnesota state statute denying driver's license to our neighbors, our friends, and our community, to some of our neighbors, friends, and community members. For years, all Minnesotans who are eligible to be able to drive at 16 years old were able to get a driver's license, and for good reason. It makes sense for our state to make sure that public safety comes first and that our friends and neighbors are trained, licensed, and are able to get insurance when they drive a car. But this was all ended in the early 2000s after 9/11, when Governor Pawlenty pushed through an emergency rulemaking procedure after 9/11 without public comment or public notice. And they denied some Minnesotans to be able to get a driver's license that could have one before. So this is not a clean, real ID bill. It doubles down on current regulatory restrictions which received numerous hearings before being rejected by the legislature, but were subsequently pushed through after 9/11. This legislation before us ought to be a clean, simple, real ID bill. Let's get it done for Minnesota, and I urge you to deny this passage of this bill so we can get on to the real business of Minnesota with a real ID bill and the things that Minnesotans really care about that make us a strong country, a strong state, and inclusive. I also just want to say we have states made up of family, friends, neighbors, and colleagues and congregants, of teachers and students. It's Minnesota's values, not immigration politics, should define who is a Minnesotan. I represent everyone in my community, and it's time we pass a real clean ID bill, and I urge you not to vote for this bill. Thank you.
Member from Hennepin, Representative Hornstein.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. At its core, this bill and its title is a bill related to transportation. And so as a member of the Transportation Finance Committee, something's been bothering me a little this afternoon, among many things. I concur with what my colleagues have said about the role of aspiring citizens in our state. But I have just a quick question for Representative Smith.
He will yield. Representative Hornstein.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and Representative Smith. So there's $7.5 million that I think is going to be encumbered by the local deputy registrars in this bill. What pot of money are we going to be using to address that $7.5 million?
Representative Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative, as stated before, the fees, if there's going to be a shortage in fees, if there's going to be a shortage, that's something that can be cared for, but there isn't going to be an impact in this regard. This program is funded correctly, and for the estimations of these numbers, we can talk about that. Every step of the way, I've reached out to anyone willing to listen about trying to make this bill better. That's been demonstrated last year when we started with a single-track bill, something that I thought was a better solution for Minnesota. And we changed that bill to be 2 tracks. There's been countless other modifications to this bill. And if the registrars can state that there is going to be insufficient funds and this local impact, that's something that we should look at, because this program is not meant to not make that program work correctly. This bill is meant to roll out real ID for everyone in the state who wants it, who wants to opt into it. You get to choose. Minnesota wants this bill. The time is now, body. The time is now to pass this bill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and Representative Smith, and thanks for that. I think that there is a recognition that we do have some incompleteness here in terms of the finance, and so unfortunately it's an issue that we're going to have to deal with. That's not a minor matter to our local deputy registrars, and I'm very concerned that this still appears to remain undone.
Member from Dakota, Representative May Quaid.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, I am also very disappointed. I thought that I would come here tonight and be able to vote on a clean bill. We should be able to give real ID to the citizens of Minnesota. But I'm also very disappointed by the tone that we have taken. People are not illegal. We should not be calling them that. The issue of unauthorized immigrants is something that we can talk about, but people are not illegal. And the way that people feel on either side of this issue is not a state of mental illness, and let's not further stigmatize folks by using that term cavalierly. So I'm disappointed. I wanted to vote tonight to give our citizens what they have asked us for, a clean bill for real ID so they can visit their children who live on Army bases, fly on airplanes, visit federal sites, the things that they have asked us for. No one asked us to wander into this area, and I don't want to wander in there with incredibly negative language. So I am very disappointed, and I'm sorry that I cannot support this bill tonight because I would like to give the constituents in my district and the rest of Minnesota a clean, real ID bill.
Member from Cottonwood, Representative Hamilton.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. And Representative Lesh, I wish that you would ask me to yield, because I would have stood here and honestly said, no, I do not know of any employers that knowingly hire undocumented workers. In fact, some of the largest employers in the ag base, they actually work with the federal government, and they work with ICE and also the Department of Homeland Security on the documents. And this is why we need comprehensive immigration reform, no question about it, as far as the needs of employers and the number of employees that are available. And so this is it's a very difficult situation. And I tell you what, I was an absolute no vote when I was first asked to support driver's license for undocumented. In fact, I was invited to come down to South Minneapolis and speak to a group of Latinos down there. And when I was sitting there, when I was the chief author of the bill, there was a lady in the audience there, and she raised her hand, and she was speaking Spanish, and I had an interpreter, and everybody kind of gasped and turned and looked at me because she called me out. She was one of the first people that came into the office that I occupied, asking me to support the driver's license for undocumented, and I said no. And when she called me out at that meeting when I was the chief author, I explained to her that I myself did not understand the issue, and I needed time to educate myself on this issue. In fact, after that meeting, I called home to local law enforcement, and I talked to a police chief who is retired now, and he said, Rod, please, for one moment, try to separate the politics, set it aside. He says, remember this, safe roads, insured drivers. He said, here's the harsh reality. If you pass the driver's license bill, you'll have individuals that will go through training, they'll take the test, they'll get a driver's license, purchase insurance, and drive on the road. If you don't pass the bill, you'll have a person who won't go through training, who won't take the test, who won't get a driver's license, who won't purchase insurance, and drive on the road. It's as simple as that. Safe roads and insured drivers. And Representative Mariani, this language does not need to be in this bill. This language is in here to take away the authority from the department from issuing driver's license to undocumented immigrants through rulemaking. That's the only reason it is in this bill. I don't support it for that reason. I don't believe it should be in here. I agree with the author when he says this should be a separate issue. We should have the debate and have the hearings in committees. I believe that, and I agree with that, but it should not be in this bill. And that's one of the other reasons why I'm voting against it. Thank you.
Member from Blue Earth, Representative Considine.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This provision is unnecessary, it is mean, and it is spiteful, in my opinion.
Member from Hennepin, Representative Carlson.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, some of what I was going to say was just stated by Representative Hamilton. In fact, he might have been on the, I was trying to remember if it was when I chaired the Finance Committee or the Ways and Means Committee when we had an excellent hearing near the end of the session that year, and many of the arguments that Representative Hamilton just shared with the body were brought up there with excellent testimony. The public safety issue people that will be potentially driving without a driver's license, meaning they haven't taken a driver's exam. They'll be driving without insurance, the high risk. So thank you for your comments on that question. But I would like to ask Representative Smith to yield to a question.
He will yield. And, Representative Carlson.
Representative Smith, what's the purpose of a local impact statement?
Member from Hennepin, Representative Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative, could you be more clear with your question, please?
Well, we've had, Mr. Speaker, Representative Smith, discussions here about the $7.5 million. And we have that information because of a local impact statement on what the fiscal cost to our local registrars and so on will be. And so I'm asking you, what is the purpose of requesting that impact statement? And I'm one of the few people in the body that has the authority under statute to request one. I didn't happen to request this particular one, but my question is, what is the purpose of that local impact statement?
Member from Hennepin, Representative Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative, I think the purpose is rather self-evident, Representative. It is to assess the value on the local, or assess the impact on the local community, the local facility.
Representative Carlson.
Speaker, the point I'm trying to make is that it's to find out what the fiscal impact is going to be. And a few moments ago, the comment was made, we can look at it. Well, that's the purpose of the fiscal impact statement. We looked at it, and we found that there is a cost of $7.5 million. And that's not being addressed here in the bill. That's something that should have been addressed and talked about in the Ways and Means Committee, along with other cost factors that earlier were brought up by Representative Hansen when he had an amendment that because we don't have a budget resolution, that Rule 4.10, I think is the number, did apply, and he withdrew the amendment. But my point is that there are some costs to this bill that are not being addressed. And when you look at the local registers, $7.5 million is real money. And I think what you're saying then is that they're going to have to eat that, which is not a good way to fund a bill. Sometimes there are bills with some very minor costs that go through that we may not address those costs. But when we're talking about $7.5 million potentially, my point is that that should have been addressed. So for a variety of reasons, one, the cost, the other, public safety, I'll be joining many of my colleagues and be voting no on the bill. And if the bill does in fact pass, hopefully the Senate will send us back a clean bill.
Further discussion on the bill. The member from Hennepin, Representative Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, this bill does not change who can receive a license today and who can receive a license tomorrow. This bill gives Minnesotans the peace of mind knowing that they're going to fly. They will be able to fly to see a loved one in another state, to go see a loved one on a military base, or to visit a federal building. Members, the time has come. Minnesota needs to be not one of the few states in the country to not move on Real ID. January 2018 is just around the corner. We need to move now on this bill. I ask for your yes vote. Thank you.
Seeing no further discussion, the clerk will take the roll on the bill. Clerk will close the roll. There being 72 ayes and 58 nays, the bill is passed as amended and its title agreed to. The next bill on the calendar for the day is House File 400. The clerk will report the bill.
House File number 400, number 2 on the calendar for the day, an act relating to state contracts.
Recognize the member from Morrison, Representative Kresha, to introduce your bill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I do have an amendment. Do we want to take that up right away?
There is an amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment.
Kresha moves to amend House File number 400, the second engrossment, as follows, and the amendment is coded A3.
Recognize the member from Morrison, Representative Kresha, to introduce your amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. The A3 amendment that we have is the language from a lot of conversations, and I just want to bring this to the forefront of where we're at and why we have this amendment. We have gone through many, many conversations, starting with taking out boycott language, taking out occupied territories, and now coming back to the amendment that you have here, which is our very, very best efforts to get agreements with all the parties. And I think we have the closest language we can get. The impetus and the best part of this amendment is line 1.14, which is making this, adding it to the subdivision of 16C.06, which essentially just adds this to any other contract where we would have discrimination. So this would give the Department of Administration the ability to handle this as we do any other discrimination in contracts. And essentially what we're doing with this bill is we are separating the state so that we no longer have discrimination against Israeli companies in contracts. And with that, I'll take questions.
Discussion on the Kresha amendment, coded A3. The member from Hennepin, Representative Carlson.
Yeah, Mr. Speaker, Representative Kresha, as you know, and as Representative Knobloch knows, Chair of Ways and Means, I made a request earlier this week when the bill was before Ways and Means that the bill simply be laid over. That was not a request in opposition to the bill. It was a request to give us an opportunity for more information. At that point in time, I had heard that there were, due to a lack of a better term, negotiations going on late the previous week and over the weekend. And since I've learned that there technically was an amendment that actually had been prepared and would have been available, it apparently didn't meet the 24-hour rule, and that would have been another argument. I didn't know at that point that the amendment was actually prepared. But one of the reasons that I was requesting that the bill be laid over, and others on the committee articulated this as well, was that I felt that because there is across the state of Minnesota in a number of households a lot of interest in this particular bill, and I felt that there should be a chance for people to weigh in on whatever that compromise ultimately was. And so you may be moving in the right direction. I hope you are, but the one thing that's lacking, when I pointed this out in committee, is that when we begin with a major amendment like this, and we refer to it as a compromise, and I hope it really is, that we lack that opportunity of people to really come forward and testify in committee. There is a reason that we have a committee process in place, and I felt that Monday morning it was important. We could have laid it over for just a day or two, and we could have seen the amendment that you brought forward here this evening.
Representative Hornstein.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Representative Kresha, I do appreciate this amendment and support it, but I want the body to know if there's any and Representative Carlson used the term compromise, and without the benefit of a hearing. I think his point was we should have kept this bill in committee and heard this amendment so that the various stakeholders could give us their perspectives. And so I don't want anyone to be under the impression that this is a complete compromise that everybody feels comfortable about with regard to the constitutional amendments. My understanding is that the ACLU believes this is progress, but still has concerns, outstanding concerns, that need to be addressed, and they worry about the constitutionality of the bill. So I just wanted the body to understand that this is not a compromise. This is not a peace in the valley amendment. It does constitute progress, which I appreciate, but I wanted to make that clear on the record.
The member from Morrison, Representative Kresha.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members, and thank you, Representative Carlson and Representative Hornstein. I want to make sure I get the expectations and the conversations correct. This bill has gone through 3 hearings. In all of that, I've had multiple emails, I've had multiple conversations, I've worked across the aisle, I've talked to stakeholders. And I appreciate the arguments that Representative Carlson is making, but I think everybody in the Ways and Means Committee knows I handed that amendment to you right away on the House floor as soon as I had a copy of it, as I promised I would. Furthermore, if we want to talk about debating this issue, don't you think it's better that you've got an amendment, you've seen it, and you've had the opportunity to debate it, and now we're debating it as a body and not just a small Ways and Means Committee? So I appreciate where you're coming from, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk about it. To Representative Hornstein, is this a perfect compromise? No, I won't even use the word compromise. I will say this gets us to the best language of all the stakeholders that we've talked to. The ACLU has changed and softened their remarks. They're still going to probably have some concerns, just as they probably will with Representative Hornstein's amendment we're going to hear later, because we haven't moved that through the committee process as well. So I'm not going to say any of this is perfect, but then again, look where we are.
Representative Carlson.
Mr. Chairman, I was the one that used the word compromise, and maybe it would have been better had I said moving in the right direction, and I plan on supporting the amendment. And I want to compliment you because when I came on the House floor, right after that meeting in Ways and Means, I had a copy of the amendment. But my point was that we lacked the opportunity for the public to weigh in and to testify in committee. Here this evening, that opportunity is lost. Had we laid the bill over and given people that opportunity, we would have known whether it was a compromise or a big step in the right direction. We just lacked that input, and that's my point, and that's why I was raising the question that morning.
The member from Sherburne, Representative Knobloch.
Mr. Speaker, members, and particularly Representative Carlson, I just want to tell you, Representative Carlson, I did not see this amendment, and there was no request to have this amendment or any other amendment that didn't come up in the Ways and Means Committee meeting. I didn't say, no, you can't offer this amendment because it doesn't meet the 24-hour rule. As to, if we should have laid it over as we talked about in Ways and Means, sometimes progress is made when you move the bill along and it brings parties together. Sometimes it makes sense to hold the bill. I was only informed that morning that some people would have liked to have held it in Ways and Means, and I guess we had already scheduled it. I didn't have any other amendments that people had come to me about offering, and it therefore seemed to me to make sense to go forward with it. So I just, since you've raised that issue, I just wanted to tell the body that.
Representative Carlson.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Speaker, Representative Knobloch, I don't think I said that you had seen the amendment. The only thing I knew at the beginning of the meeting was that the various interested parties had sat down, and I understood that they had worked late that week, as I said earlier, and through the weekend to come up with new language. Maybe that's the best way to refer to it. And because I was aware that that was taking place, that's why I asked for it to be laid over so we could get testimony. I'm not going to say that I saw it or you saw it, although I did see it shortly after the meeting. The language had been drafted, and I think at least one or two others here on the House floor may have seen it shortly after the meeting as well. But my whole point is that it would have been of a high degree of value if we would have had that opportunity for public input. That's the bottom line. And if you'll recall, I didn't make a motion. I made a request at the beginning of the meeting that it be laid over because I knew things were being talked about. You took testimony and took the author's presentation. Then I again asked after that, because I still had in the back of my mind that these negotiations were taking place. And in the end, they were closer to having finalized language that they were going to propose than I even realized. But be that as may, we can go back and forth. But I'm not faulting you for seeing an amendment that you didn't see somehow, because none of us had seen it. But we did know that there was conversations going on.
Member from Hennepin, Representative Nelson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. And Representative Kresha, I saw this bill in government operations, and there were some concerns about that, and there was about this bill, and there was a lot of testimony on it. And as has been said here already, that's one of the reasons we try and do committee work in committees, is so that the public can have the transparency that we all want in our government, and they can testify for and against the bills, and they don't get a chance to do that when we do amendments like this on the floor. So, would Representative Kresha stand for a question?
He will yield. Representative Hansen.
Thank you,
Nelson. Sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Question I have is, looking at this and looking how the bill has changed with the amendment, how are we as the state, how is the MMB supposed to be able to enforce this? I mean, it says they have to bring forth a certificate. What do we do if they find out that they might have accidentally or somewhere along the line possibly violated this law? How is MMB going to find that out, and how are they going to enforce that against the contractors?
Member from Morrison, Representative Kresha.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and Representative Nelson, thank you for the question. The same way that they will with any other discrimination in contracts, if you're going to apply for state dollars, you have to make sure you understand the regulations and certify that you are not knowingly violating those. And if you are, well, then you'll be dishonest, and if at some point you're caught, I suspect they will handle it like they do any other discrimination.
Representative Nelson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. Looking at this and looking at the bill, like I said, I don't like these type of bills. I mean, we've got every once in a while we get these bills that tell us to disinvest our money and because of this or because of that, and we hear from the Pension Commission when I was on that, we hear from the State Investment Board that it's difficult to do that with the large size of our portfolio we have. This is trying to go at that same thing in a different manner, and I guess I just don't see how this is going to be that effective. I think it's a feel-good type of piece of legislation for some people, and I don't know. I don't like the way this is going, and I'm going to vote like I did in committee.
Further discussion on the A3 amendment. Seeing no further discussion, all those in favor of adoption of the A3 amendment signify by saying aye. Those opposed, no. The motion prevails and the amendment is adopted. There is another amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment.
Hornstein moves to amend House File Number 400, second engrossment as amended, and the amendment is coded DEA 4.
Recognize the member from Hennepin, Representative Hornstein, to introduce your amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I believe that Representative Kresha, do you have an amendment to my amendment?
There is an amendment to the amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment.
Kresha moves to amend the Hornstein amendment to House File Number 400, second engrossment as amended, and the amendment to the amendment is coded A4.
I recognize the member from Morrison, Representative Kresha, to introduce your amendment to the DE4 amendment. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. And this amendment is highly technical and incredibly powerful. And we delete August and move in July.
Discussion on the A4 amendment to the DE4 Hornstein amendment. Any discussion? Seeing no discussion, all those in favor of adoption of the Kresha amendment signify by saying aye. Those opposed, no. The motion prevails. The amendment to the amendment is adopted. We are now on the DE4 Hornstein amendment as amended. The member from Hennepin, Representative Hornstein.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. Because this bill has evolved into one that discusses discrimination in state contracts, I thought it would be useful to look at, excuse me, some other models from around the country that address this issue. And so the DE4 amendment is very similar to legislation that is now being offered in the state of Massachusetts. And this legislation actually accomplishes the same goals as Representative Kresha's bill, but it also adds other categories of Minnesotans that would be impacted by discrimination in state contracts. So we're simply adding race, creed, color, national origin. The new part of this law, though that's existing law, the new part is adding national origin. And I think that's also similar to some of the language that Representative Kresha has, but it's more inclusive. So if you're Israeli, you're covered. If you're Palestinian, you're covered. If you're Canadian, you're covered. If you're Norwegian, you're covered under this bill. And what I think this amendment does is it sends out a welcome mat to all Minnesotans to do business with the state and to know they will not be discriminated against. And another reason I like this approach is that it's supported by Jewish communal organizations in Massachusetts from the left, right, and center. Sometimes it's difficult for our community to agree on things, as I think many communities that exists. But so I think it is a wonderful way to approach this issue. And I would ask for your support because, again, it covers everybody, anyone who's doing business with the state. And that's the proper way to go. And that's historically the way our community has approached discrimination and civil rights. Important to have that for our fellow members of the Jewish community, but also for any group that's suffering from discrimination. And so that's the approach I'm taking, and I ask for your support.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Flanagan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As many of you know, my community has been hit particularly hard by the recent rise in anti-Semitism that is sweeping across the country. Just last month, an anonymous caller called in a bomb threat against the Sabbath Jewish Community Center in St. Louis Park. As I told this body then, this was an attack that shook the confidence of Jewish people in my district and made them feel less safe in their own homes. The uptick in anti-Semitism in this country is alarming, and I support the principle of non-discrimination that is in the heart of this bill. But our Minnesota values of inclusion and mutual respect demand that we fight against discrimination in all forms, not just a select few. This amendment would forbid the state contractors from discriminating on the basis of race, national origin, color, sex, sexual orientation, or disability. This change would simply take Representative Kresha's rock-solid principle of non-discrimination and extend it to more Minnesotans. So ask yourself, should a state contractor legally be able to discriminate on the basis of race? Should a state contractor be able to legally discriminate on the basis of national origin? Should a state contractor legally be able to discriminate on the basis of color? Should a state contractor legally be able to discriminate on the basis of sex? Should a state contractor legally be able to discriminate on the basis of sexual orientation? And should a state contractor legally be able to discriminate on the basis of disability? This kind of blatant discrimination still happens. And in fact, we saw proof of this just yesterday that LGBTQ Minnesotans no longer have an ally in the White House. It's up to us to step in and to fill that void in this state. Minnesotans want to know that we have their backs no matter what happens on the federal level. This is our chance to do that, and I would encourage a yes vote on this amendment.
The member from Morrison, Representative Kresha.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the comments of Representative Hornstein and Representative Flanagan. I support the concept. In fact, I signed on the original bill, and I think where we're going is to have those conversations, and I would encourage us to take those back through committee and bring them up and have the full weight. So I support where we're going with this, but I want to be very specific and narrow with my bill today.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Hornstein.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and members. I appreciate your hearing our ideas here. And I did have a conversation just briefly earlier today on the floor. I don't see Representative O'Driscoll. He's the chair of government operations. And he indicated at least the possibility later in the session that this bill could be heard in his committee. And I will continue to work very hard on this. I think this is the proper way to go. It addresses the issues we're trying to address today, far more inclusive in terms of far broader definition and conversation about national origin in state contracts. So I look forward to a possible or potential hearing later, perhaps quite a bit later in session, but I'll be continuing to work on this, and I appreciate everyone's conversation. I know where this is going. We haven't gone through the committee process yet, and for that reason, I'll withdraw the amendment at this time.
Representative Hornstein withdraws the DE4 amendment as amended. There are no further amendments at the desk. The clerk will give the bill its third reading.
Third reading, House File number 400, as amended.
Third reading. Discussion on House File 400 as amended. The member from Hennepin, Representative Rosenthal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and Representative Kresha, I talked to you earlier and hope you'd yield for a question.
He will yield. Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Kresha, I know you've come a long way with this bill. I know you've worked really, really hard. I'd just like to ask you a simple question. In your bill, what are the boundaries of Israel?
The member from Morrison, Representative Kresha.
I thought it was going to be simple. Thank you. And I appreciate you coming up and we had a chance to talk about this. So as I understand it, to the best that I can answer this question, admin would defer to the federal government's definition, which is the 1948 borders, with the exception of Jerusalem, including West Jerusalem. This is why originally I had put in the territories, because we end up picking and choosing which Israeli companies. But at this point, it would just be referring back up to the federal definition, which for all intent purposes, people should recognize the federal government doesn't even acknowledge Jerusalem at this point.
Representative Rosenthal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Representative Kresha, I appreciate the answer, but if you look online or you look up the state borders, the borders have changed many times and they continue to change. They're not the same as they were in 1948, 1967, 1998, or today. So I think we should have a little clarity about the borders in the bill. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, members.
The member from Olmsted, Representative Liebling.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. Well, Representative Nelson, I think it was, said this is a feel-good bill. I think for some members it may be a feel-good bill. For me, it's kind of a feel-bad bill. And I'm going to explain why. So members, under normal circumstances, I'm very private about my religion, because I believe that religion is a private matter for me and for all Minnesotans who choose to practice or not practice a religion. And I also am a firm believer in separation of church and state. But today, I feel forced to speak publicly about my religion, because I think this bill is put forward by some members to demonstrate their support of Israel. And so it's kind of a litmus test for some members about whether other members may support Israel. And I think this is very wrong. So I'm going to begin by telling members and the public that I'm Jewish, and I'm a service-going, Torah-studying, candle-lighting, prayer-saying Jew. That is what I am, a proud Jew. I have prayed at the Western Wall of the Temple in Jerusalem. I love the land of the Bible with its sense of history and holiness and possibilities. My father fought the Nazis in Europe in World War II, and I love the fact that there exists in the world a Jewish state. But Israel is not just a holy land or a refuge for an often persecuted people. It is also a modern nation with policies and politics that Americans sometimes agree with and sometimes don't. I want this modern nation to continue, and I want it to fulfill its potential as a holy nation, just as I want America to fulfill its potential as a democratic and just nation where everyone can find opportunity and freedom. Just this last Saturday, we read in the Torah the portion called Yitro, which is in Genesis chapter 19, where God tells Moses to tell the Hebrews, "You shall be to me a kingdom of princes and a holy nation." I believe that Israel continues to struggle to figure out what that means and how to fulfill it, just as America continues in the struggle to fulfill the vision of its founders. So how can we help a nation to reach its highest goals? I think it's the same way we can help each other to reach our goals, with love, with support, and sometimes with criticism. Criticism of Israel is not anti-Semitism. I want to say that again. Criticism of Israel is not, by itself, anti-Semitism. Of course, there are times when criticism of Israel is anti-Semitism, and lately, as one of my colleagues pointed out, we've seen plenty of anti-Semitism and even attacks on Jews and Jewish institutions around the world, and these are horrifying. Sometimes I'm glad that my dad is not alive to see it. But we also see attacks on Muslims and African Americans and Native Americans and LGBT people and people everywhere who are vilified as the other, and that is also horrifying. The bill we're considering now is supposed to discourage discrimination against Israel. It may or may not actually do that. What I am afraid it may do is start us down a slippery slope where we use the power of government, in this case the economic power of government, to tell our citizens with whom they may associate or not associate. This violates the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, and simply adding a clause to the bill, as Representative Kresha did, a clause that says it doesn't stop protected speech or expression, does not change the fact that it does. It does. In America, the way to oppose hateful and discriminatory speech is with other speech, not by using the power of government to punish the speaker. And the way to oppose a boycott with which we don't agree is to do business with the entity that is boycotted, not by asking government to punish the person who's doing the boycotting. What this legislature should be protecting is not Israel as such or any other nation. That is not a proper role for the Minnesota government. We should not be involved in doing that. Instead, we should be protecting the precious rights of all of us to peacefully exercise our freedom of conscience. The right to speak freely must include the right to be wrong and sometimes even to say odious things. The right to free association must include the right to not associate with others, as perhaps for a vendor to not associate with Israel if that is their choice. These rights are our protection against authoritarianism and tyranny, and they are being stepped on in this bill. And as an American who believes in the Constitution and as a Jew, a proud Jew, I strongly oppose this bill, and I urge other members to join me in voting no.
The gentleman from Wright, Representative Lucero.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members, and I rise in strong support of this bill, and I want to thank Representative Kresha for bringing this forward and for all the co-authors who signed on, and I am proud to be one of those co-authors. I just wanted to briefly mention that my wife and I have had the opportunity to visit Israel twice, and in the second visit to Israel, we had the honor of visiting the Knesset. And during the visit to the Knesset, we met with one of the members of the Knesset, and then in a different meeting, we met with a second member. So we met with two members of the Knesset. And one of the questions was posed, or when the question was posed to each of them, each of the members, what can we as Minnesotans do to help support the nation Israel? Both of their answers was, BDS is a national security issue to Israel, so please do what you can to support us in stopping BDS. And this bill is one step that can lead in that direction, or that does lead in that direction. So by supporting this, members, we are supporting the nation Israel in their plea to us to support their national security. So thank you, members, and again, I urge a green vote.
Discussion on House File 400 as amended. The gentleman from Hennepin, Representative Hornstein.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. The topic of Israel contained in this bill is one that I have a deep connection to. My parents, of blessed memory, were Holocaust survivors. My mother was Polish. She lost her father and her two brothers. Her entire family were killed. My dad was Hungarian, and he lost both of his parents, two brothers, a sister. But two of his three surviving brothers went to Israel after the war. And so most of my extended family, because we lost so much, lives in Israel. So I visited there many, many times, including a couple of wonderful trips with colleagues, several of whom are here. And I once heard a saying that if you go to this region, the Middle East, Israel, Palestine, you feel that after a week you could write a book. Then maybe after a month, you could write a chapter of a book. But if you stay much longer, there's just not much to write because you're hearing so many stories and so many narratives, so many truths, so much fear and hatred and also triumph. And so there's just a lot of nuance in that part of the world. And that is why I urge you to visit the region if you can. Holy to three religions, as Representative Lucero alluded to. And if you go to the region, go to both Israel and Palestine. And if you visit Palestine and you go to Bethlehem, and you see Jesus' birthplace at the Church of the Nativity, which I know is very special and meaningful to many, also go to the Dheisheh refugee camp and talk with the Palestinians who live there about their lives under occupation. Maybe you can view Jewish settlements in their region from their perspective when you look out at the hilltops that surround the city of Bethlehem. And when you go to Israel, there's a lot to do in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem and the Sea of Galilee. But also go to the south. Go to Sderot, which is near the Gaza border, or even Kibbutz Kfar Aza, where my cousins live. They recently moved out of there because the rocket and mortar fire from across the border was so incessant that after their neighbor was killed 10 yards away from their home, they moved 5-10 miles away, which in that region is actually a lot of territory, and they feel a little safer. But talk to the people there about what it's like to live with that constant threat. And so the Middle East is complex, and our relationship to it It demands that we understand the nuances of it, the nuances of the conflict, the narratives of the people that are there. And we need to address issues related to Israel and Palestine with great care. And that is why I was so concerned when House File 400 was introduced, with language that referred to Israel and Israeli-controlled territories. And I want to thank Representative Kresha for taking that language out, because that's anything but nuanced. And it's highly divisive even in my own Jewish community, because it implies that Israel's borders include all of its settlements. And these are subject to negotiations. It's been a vexing process, but you know, there's no other alternative than for these sides to talk, and we have to do all we can as a state to ensure that the two-state solution remains on the table, as for the first time it's being publicly talked about in an American administration that maybe it's not part of the solution. I was, and I'm still concerned about the constitutional issues in this bill that Representative Liebling referred to that have been raised today. I appreciate, Representative Kresha, your amendment today. As I said, it gets us part of the way there on those issues. It doesn't resolve them. It doesn't get us all the way there. And so it's my hope that as this legislation progresses, and we still have the other body, I didn't want to say the S word, we still have the other body that has to go through its committee process. We still have the executive branch that I hope will weigh in. And I hope that the discussions, Representative Kresha, that you've had with the ACLU and the JCRC can continue, that this isn't the end, that you've shown that progress can be made on some thorny questions in this bill. Don't end the process now. Work with Senator Limmer, work with, oops, I said the word, work with Mr. Limmer and others in the Department of Administration to get this right, because it needs to be gotten right. So this isn't the approach I would have taken to this bill. I talked about the Massachusetts model. If anything, if we were going to do this at all, it should be done perhaps as a resolution, which we take on complex issues related to foreign affairs or other issues like that. Representative Sandstead had made that suggestion in the GovOps committee, and I thought it was a good one. But this bill is before us. It's what we have. And the fact that we've now opened the door, albeit not as wide as we should, to discuss the issue of discrimination in state contracts, and the fact that, to me, you got perhaps the most egregious part of the bill related to Israel and Israeli-controlled territory, I do, with quite a bit of reservation, feel comfortable supporting it today. But I urge you, Representative Kresha, as the author, to continue to get the unresolved issues resolved so it can be a better bill. Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, members. I am the first non-Jewish person to represent my district actually in decades. This is both House and the Senate. Members heard about this earlier this week when I spoke about the St. Paul Jewish Community Center, an institution in my district, and one that's welcoming to people of all different faiths. When there was the JCC was the target of anti-Semitism, of threats, along with a number of other sites around the country. This bill prohibits state agencies from contracting with vendors, that engage in discrimination with Israel. There's no evidence that I'm aware of that there are any vendors that in fact qualify for that. There are no vendors that can be identified that are in fact doing that at this point. The bill, of course, raises significant constitutional concerns. This is similar, I'll note, to a number of bills that are going through the process, I think many of us are aware of, that raise a number of concerns. There was that amendment that has been put on the bill that has the blanket statement that the bill does not limit vendors' constitutional rights, and I suppose that can be used in the litigation that may come from this. But of course, there are still these concerns. The department has said that it can't administer the bill. Again, it's been amended to allow the department to waive this provision if it's not practicable or not in the best interest of Minnesota, which arguably then raises the question of what the purpose of the bill is and what it can be used for. And finally, of course, this is our state legislature engaging in foreign policy. This has been alluded to in a number of remarks that have been made. I've heard from constituents with strong views on policy in the Middle East. That's been brought up in points along the way as well. Having said all this, I too appreciate the changes that have been made along the way to remove some of the most egregious concerns, the amendments that I've referred to and others. And much more importantly than that, I'm conscious of the role that we all have, the title we have of representative. And I circle back to the point that I made at the beginning, and representing the residents of my district and the constituents that I have, recognizing the great concern that they have about this issue and about broader concerns in the world. So I too, with great reluctance, will be voting in favor of the bill in recognition of my role as a representative in my district, and I do hope that over time this discussion can be broadened. I'm just disappointed regarding the amendment being withdrawn. I'm hopeful we can pursue that and recognize that the absolutely present discrimination, anti-Semitism, discrimination against Israel, can be recognized as being part of a much broader set of concerns by discrimination on all the different bases, and we can have our state be a leader in human rights and continue to be across a wide variety of bases now and into the future. Thank you.
Discussion. The gentleman from Hennepin, Representative Hertas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And this has been a great conversation. I wanted to just share with you, members, last year during spring break, I happened to be in Arizona, and a legislative colleague in the Arizona legislature knew that I was in town and asked me if I would come and speak to their committee in the legislature on states' rights and federalism. And while I was there to talk about another issue, this bill was introduced, pretty much a clone bill of the same thing in the Arizona legislature. And I took a particular interest in it, mainly because I grew up in St. Louis Park. And many of my high school classmates and my very best friends, very high Jewish population, were my peers. And I grew up with my classmates as such and really learned so much about Israel and the Jewish culture. In fact, at that time when I was a high school student, the Holocaust training was really quite extensive. It was similar to visiting the Holocaust Museum in Washington. And my friendship grew very strongly while in St. Louis Park, so much to the degree that when I got married in a Catholic wedding, my best man was a Jew. And conversely, I was his best man twice. But I make that point because what we're seeing right now all through the nation is we're seeing an outrage industry of trying to manipulate what we do with monies and investments in pension plans and trying to isolate Israel. And so I shared the concern that Representative Hornstein has made and Rep. Kresha, your bill. And I also had a little bit of concern, as Representative Liebling did. I actually had considered maybe introducing this or preparing to introduce it even when we came back from break. But thanks for the discussion, and I am in support of the bill. Thank you.
The gentleman from Hennepin, Representative Applebaum.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As a Jew, Israel is very important to me. Based upon my 32 years of living in my district, in addition to the flood of emails and phone calls I've received from constituents in support of this bill, I know that Israel is very important to my community. As an American, fighting against discrimination and anti-Semitism is very important to me. The boycott, divestment, and sanctions, or BDS movement, is discrimination, and it is anti-Semitism, and it must not be supported by anyone, let alone the state of Minnesota. I'm proud to be the lead DFL author on this bill, and I'm grateful to have worked with Representative Kresha and others in a bipartisan fashion to ensure that Minnesota taxpayers will not be subsidizing discrimination, anti-Semitism, and BDS. I ask for your vote, and thank you again.
The lady from Ramsey, Representative Moran.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wasn't going to speak on this bill, and I probably cannot speak on this bill because I'm not as versed as some may be around the conflict between the Palestinians and Israel. But I was just going through this document here, and I was looking at, don't believe the hype, what House File 400 and Senate File 247 doesn't and does do. So it lists a bunch of things that this bill does not do, and then it states that what it does do, it ensures that Minnesota may not enter into a contract with a vendor that engages in discrimination against Israel or against persons or entities doing business in Israel. So as an African-American woman, I thought to myself, often enough, the African-American community is discriminated against for numerous different reasons, which I truly oppose. But it's often hard to prove discrimination. So my question to Representative Kresha, help me understand how you would know if a vendor has discriminated against Israel. Representative Kresha, would you raise to that question? Would you rise for that question?
The gentleman will yield. The gentleman from Morrison, Representative Kresha.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for the question, Representative Moran. I believe there's 80-some pages on handling discrimination in state contracts, and this would be part of that process. So while I can't speak directly to how they will do that, I expect they're going to follow that process with this discrimination or potential discrimination as they would anything else.
The lady from Ramsey, Representative Moran.
Mr. Speaker, and since I don't have a list of those 87 reasons how they can define how someone is discriminated against, and I'm sure in the United States of America, I'm sure we also may have a list of ways that we can define someone being discriminated against. But I know often enough it is hard, or for some reason, often enough it's not proven, right? We go years and years and we debate back and forth without finding reasons why someone has been discriminated against, when often enough, to many members in my community, it's obvious. And so I just had to speak to that because, to have a bill that says it ensures that Minnesota may not enter into a contract with a vendor that engages in discrimination against Israel, I just felt that what would that look like? And how would someone prove that? And this seemed like a really, really difficult task. I'm hoping it's difficult because it's not an easy task to do my own personal experience. It has not been an easy thing to find. And so my thought was that, as we move forward in this body, and as we look at, even within the United States of America and in Minnesota, that we are creating laws that respect all people, that we create laws and policies that create the practices that we're all valued in a way that brings some humanity to us. That is kind of like what the Palestinians are also asking for, right? It's a complicated situation. It's complicated. And here we are in Minnesota trying to be a part of trying to solve that piece that is so complicated and not always informed, not always educated. And we don't live it. We don't live it. And it's hard to bring solutions to an issue that you have not lived and are not a part of. So on the stance that, you know, that I see that we have taken a side that I know I'm not informed about, that I'm not educated on, that I have not lived or been a part of it. I cannot support this bill in its form and hope that, you know, this body will vote it down. Thank you.
The lady from Dakota, Representative Mason.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Members, a number of years ago, I was extremely privileged to visit the state of Israel along with Representative Hornstein, Liebling, Anderson, and we got to see so much of the country. And actually, we actually covered more than Israel itself. We actually got into Jordan but the one thing that is so important there is a small property, and it's a life and death situation that I think we really need to think about very seriously when we are taking a position here in Minnesota. Again, I love the country. We want the best for the people over there. But I do not believe that we are in a position to truly take a position like this or to pass an amendment. So I will be voting no, and I hope you seriously think about the people that live in that area and how much an impact something like this will have in them.
The gentleman from Hennepin, Representative Davney.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. Representative Kresha, congratulations on another challenging bill. There's a few things that I'm clear on and a whole bunch of things in this bill that I'm not so clear on. One of the things that I'm clearest on is that I was not elected to do foreign policy. I think our colleagues in the U.S. House and U.S. Senate would agree with me that foreign policy is part of their job and not part of ours. And I voted accordingly in the past. And that would make for an easy no. But I've watched my state and my city, my state and my country over this past year or so. And I'm somewhere between deeply concerned and on some days terrified by what I've seen. We've had a presidential election where one of the candidates rose to the highest office in the land with anti-Semitic rhetoric and themes from his campaign, where he then placed a virulent anti-Semite as his chief of strategy and provided him with an office 10 feet away from the Oval Office. We've got a presidential administration that on Holocaust Remembrance Day didn't mention the place of the Jewish people of Europe in their commemoration of the Holocaust, and instead took that day as the day to announce a ban on Muslims entering the United States. We've seen a dramatic rise across the country in anti-Semitic acts. The representative from St. Louis Park, the representative from St. Paul have both risen in this body in the last weeks after bomb threats were called in to the Jewish community centers in their communities. And I've got a little bit of a taste of the fear that that community experienced with those threats. But we've seen swastikas painted on buildings, placed in schools. We've seen the University of Minnesota be a place of organizing for today's Nazis. At the time that we acknowledge that the greatest generation that Representative Liebling referenced with her father are dying off. We're seeing the rise in the very ideology that they fought against. And at the same time, in the last few months, every room that I've been in where the focus has been on the rise of discrimination against any people, the Jewish community has been there. They've been there and said very strongly, very clearly, we have seen this before. And they're standing with those parts of our community that have been most targeted by the fear and hatred and executive orders that we've seen over this last year. I'm powerfully moved by the sense of deep faith and solidarity that I have seen and experienced from the Jewish community in the Twin Cities these last months. I've got concerns about some of the actions of the State of Israel. I have not had the opportunity to travel there. I know it only from a distance. I'm frankly old enough that as I grew up, progressives instinctively supported the right of Israel to exist, and I still hold to that, even while having concerns and some criticism of how that state operates today, and certainly deep concerns about its current government. So today, Representative Kresha, I'm not going to vote for your bill for the foreign policy because I don't know enough to make a decision on that. And that's not what my voters sent me to do. But I will vote for the bill to stand with the Jewish community that's so challenged and so under assault, that they get my support today in no uncertain terms. Thank you.
Discussion. The clerk will take the roll on the bill as amended. Oh, okay. The lady from Hennepin, Representative Omar. The lady from Hennepin.
Thank you, Chair. Speaker. I have been really sitting here thinking about if I wanted to say something, if I should say something. I think I know a little bit about discrimination. I face it every single day. I carry multiple identities that are constantly being discriminated against. I thank the author for thinking about this particular bill. But I am saddened by the particular purpose I believe this bill serves. Some of the members in this room have spoken to and would like to believe that this is a particular bill that is to support the Jewish community. Some would even think that this is a great bill because we are a body that is fighting against discrimination. If those two things were true, there would have been a great support for Representative Hornstein's amendment. I believe that this is the kind of thing we bring forth so that we create more division. We further a narrative that says particular people's concerns, the oppressions that they may feel, the ways that they might see they might want to use their freedoms in order to oppose a government that they might feel is oppressing, is not okay. And they don't have a right to do so. As many of you know, I come from Africa. And I wasn't old enough to know all that was happening in South Africa when the apartheid was prevalent there, when South Africa was an apartheid state. But I remember my grandfather talking to me about the stories of apartheid South Africa and telling me how that conversation shifted because so many people of conscience, so many people who understood that it was obviously immoral for countries to continue to support South Africa, have decided that they were going to engage in boycotts of that government so that that system would go down. And so what we might see today and what we might not agree with, because it is not a popular discourse, might actually be a reality that some people might be living in. And we here in Minnesota, certainly in this body, who are not educated enough to understand the nuances of the people who are living in Israel and Palestine, are going through, should not be having these conversations about what is appropriate and what it isn't. I certainly never advocate for any kind of discrimination. I never will. But what I do advocate for is for all of us to work towards furthering peace in the world. And I do believe that you never get to having peace without justice. That is a fundamental thing that first must happen before we further peace. We know, and I'm certainly saddened by the rise of anti-Semitism, and I have been part of a community that has been raising funds to support the Jewish community in this time of need. Because as my community is struggling with the particular ban that our president wants to put on us, the Jewish community has been side by side, fighting with us, making sure that we have the resources that we need. Because I think there is a particular connection and brotherhood and sisterhood that Muslims and Jews have. One that is fundamentally based in our shared space in history, our shared land, and one that we will never forget. But what governments do and what is based in systems are very different. They truly are. And so I oppose this bill. I would love to have voted for a bill that would have expanded our ideals of fighting against discrimination, in being a body that actually stood up against all discrimination. I don't want to be part of a vote that limits the ability for people to fight towards that justice and peace. Thank you.
Discussion. The gentleman from Morrison, the author of the bill, Representative Kresha.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, members, for a good debate. I don't really have any prepared closing remarks, so I'll just speak from where I'm at. And the first thing I want to start with is Representative Hornstein, thank you. I truly believe that I have a new contact in my cell phone of a colleague that I can trust, a man of his word, and we've gone back and forth. And in every single instance when we said we were going to do something, it was done. And that, I want to say to anybody that may be watching this, please know that that happens here. Please know that when we touch on these thorny issues, when we come to issues that there may not be agreement all around the fringes, there still are people that are willing to put their word on the line and do the right thing. A couple of things that I've heard, and I thought about this, and one of the things that I want to say is nothing in this bill should challenge anybody's experience or values, or voting for this should make you contradict who you are. This is simply a bill for me, and it's not simply, but it's a bill that says, I understand the evidence that anti-Semitism exists. I understand that the BDS movement, as indicated by President Obama, then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, other national actors who've said this needs to stop. This is not the right approach. This is economic terrorism. I find it, for me, difficult to say, how do we define discrimination when the evidence is all around us? When we come up with announcements and talking about the bomb threats and talking about the ways that we continually see discrimination against Israeli companies. And so I see that evidence. And this bill is a response to that. This bill is a response to say that's not okay. That's not okay. If we're going to walk into a community and stand shoulder to shoulder with that community, even though we're not part of that community, we should be able to, in my mind, put something forward in a legislative manner that states that value. And that's what I'm doing. I don't know how people will vote on this. I know how I'm going to vote on this, and I know why I'm doing this. I've been approached by members in the Jewish community who I now regard as friends to a lot of them. And I'm glad that I've had a chance to meet these, and I look forward to more friendships. I look forward to more relationships. I also look forward to standing up when I hear people say the BDS movement needs to be opposed. That has been said time and time again by the national actors. It's been said in 16 states. I didn't just wake up and say, here's a great bill idea. I came to the legislature one day and was approached by someone who said, Ron, can you help us make a statement against the BDS because it needs to stop? And so, members, what you have in front of you, in my opinion, is a bill that says we need to allow Israel to continue on its self-determination path, whatever that may be. You may agree or disagree with the government efforts. You may agree or disagree with anything in the Middle East, but the state of Minnesota shouldn't subsidize that. And we shouldn't discriminate against Israeli companies. And so with that, I think I'll just ask for your green vote, Mr. Speaker and members.
Discussion. The clerk will take the roll on House File number 400 as amended. Members, please vote. The clerk will close the roll. There being 98 ayes and 20 nays, House File 400 as amended is passed. There is a next bill on the calendar for the day is House File number 434.
House File number 434, number 3 on the calendar for the day, an act relating to natural resources, the second engrossment.
The gentleman from Roseau, Chairman Fabian.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. I can do this in just a few minutes. House File 434 is a bill that's designed to address a very critical issue in much of rural Minnesota and other areas. There's some things being handed out right now. This is addressing, we're taking $5 million from the general fund and we're putting it into the Wetland Bank program that's administered through Bowser. There are several road projects that would be existing roads and reconstruction that need to have wetland credits in order to be able to complete the to start the project. So what this is doing is it's allowing the mandate that the state has to provide these wetland credits to many rural counties so that they can get their road projects going on time this spring. There's also a couple of other things in the bill that will allow for some exchanges of credits between wetland bank areas, and also will waive temporarily some rules that are in place, provided that we meet the federal standards with regards to 404 permits. And with that, I'll stand for questions, Mr. Speaker.
Discussion. There are no amendments at the desk. The clerk will give the bill its third reading.
Third reading, House File number 434.
Third reading. Discussion to the bill. The gentleman from Carleton, Representative Sundin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'll thank the author for bringing this bill forward. It's important for the road construction in a couple of areas of the state. But I'm just wondering about the money that's necessary for this. You know, this seems like just a little bit of a patchwork. Going forward, what's the true investment that we're going to be looking at for wetland banks? If the author would yield, please.
He will yield. The gentleman from Roseau, Representative Chairman Fabian.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Representative Sundin, this is a bill and it expires. This should carry us through for 2 years. What happens in the future is to be determined.
Gentleman from Carleton, Representative Sundin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And to the author, that really wasn't much of an answer. I'm looking forward to a clear answer on what we're going to need to invest to make certain that we preserve this program and moving forward.
The gentleman from Couchiching, Representative Eklund.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, members. I stand in support of House File 434. This bill is needed because of the number of districts that they find their banks are empty. There's no credits left in the accounts. So I support this bill. The trouble, it'll put thousands of dues-paying union members to work this summer on road projects. That's a good thing. But in reality, this bill's only a Band-Aid. One we need to fix by passing a long-term bonding bill that'll truly address the accounts that need to be funded to keep this vital program going. So, members, I urge a green vote, and thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from Washington, Chairman Detmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Representative Fabian, for bringing this forward. I'm a co-author on the bill, and I've worked closely with our county commissioners in Washington County. We have a lot of road work that needs to be done, and this is going to help us go forward with those projects. Thank you so much.
Discussion, the gentleman from Dakota, Representative Hansen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I think, Representative Fabian, you're going to see a lot of votes for this today. But the reason I rise is why do we have this bill here? We have this bill here because there was a failure last year, a failure that resulted in the bonding bill being called dessert and waiting till the end. So we have a patchwork. As my colleagues from the north said, we have a patchwork here, fixing a little bit, being able to do a little bit. Right now, there's a sheet being passed out of all the needs that are out there. Tens of millions of needs. So This is $5 million in need. The governor, in his budget, submitted $5 million for immediate need.
Excuse me, Representative Hansen. Members, please take your conversations to the alcove or the retiring room. The gentleman from Dakota, Representative Hansen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The governor's budget has $5 million in general fund, which we see here today, and $10 million in bonding. $10 million in bonding that we need as part of a larger bill. So now this is the second bill coming forward where we're taking a little bit. We had the Rural Finance Authority. Now we have a general fund use. I'm hearing rumors, Mr. Speaker and Representative Fabian, that when this bill goes over, there's going to get stuff attached to it. There's going to be projects that are going to get attached to this bill, and it's going to come back. So then there's a few more projects that get done. Then we'll see another bill or another bill that take pieces of bonding that we may be fixing with a general fund use. And at the end of the day, we've got $200, $300 million spent on bonding for individuals' projects, but not an entire project. So I think you're going to see broad support today for this bill because we essentially have to do it. We have projects, road projects, that are not going to be done. It's going to affect transportation, and ultimately when you affect transportation, you're affecting jobs. So I encourage a yes vote, but I'm also discouraged that we're looking at a piecemeal patchwork process that actually has an outcome that doesn't fit one Minnesota. It looks like we're going to be meeting immediate needs, following up on the failure from last year by fixing each one. And we all may vote for each one of those projects. But at the end of the day, that's picking and choosing, limiting our options, and resulting in another failure.
Discussion. The clerk will take the roll on House File 434. The clerk will close the roll. There being 126 ayes and 0 nays, the bill is passed and it's titled agreed to. There being no objection, we will revert to messages from the Senate.
Message from the Senate, Mr. Speaker. I hereby announce the passage by the Senate of the following House file herewith returned as amended by the Senate, in which amendments the concurrence of the House is respectfully requested. House File Number 113, an act relating to energy. The message is signed by Cal R. Ludeman, Secretary of the Senate. Newberger moves that the House concur in the Senate amendments to House File Number 113 and that the bill be repassed as amended by the Senate.
The gentleman from Sherburne, Representative Newberger.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, members. The concurrence and repassage of House File 113 is an improvement from the original language that we had passed off the floor last week pertaining to the power plant in Becker, the Sherco, what will be now called the Sherco 4 power plant. This Senate language, it addresses many of the concerns and bridges the gaps. It has strong bipartisan support in that other body that begins with S. And we also have strong support that's been stated from our executive. I just want to thank everyone for your support in the past. What this basically does, members, is it allows some interaction here with the Public Utilities Commission if there are any changes to be made in the process. Also, what we have factored into this through the Senate language is some solid consumer protections. It will make this whole thing subject to a rate case. There is also an evaluation that will be done by an independent evaluator to put in a sliding scale for this for a rate of return. All of these are really strong consumer protections. We had Peace in the Valley over in that other body, and members, I'm really pleased to bring this to you today. With that, Mr. Speaker, that's my bill.
Is there any discussion on the Senate amendments? Delay from Hennepin, Representative Wagenius.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Newberger, on behalf of my constituents, which are all Excel users, I'm going to be voting no on this motion and on the final vote. And here's why. Essentially, there's not a change in the bill as it left the House floor. Excel can still choose to do a supersized plant, and that would be 786 kilowatts, when the PUC said it should be maybe about 750. They can make that choice. It will be a $1 billion plant with $52 million a year of expense, of money going out of the state of Minnesota, out into other states to provide jobs in other states. There might have been an alternative if this had gone to the PUC, that some of those kilowatts would have been wind and gone to rural Minnesota and gone on to property tax bases across the state, not just in one district. But basically, this is too expensive. Consumers are not protected, and unfortunately, because we didn't follow the process, this should be a no vote for anyone who has Excel constituents.
Any further discussion? There being no further discussion, all those in favor of the motion to concur with the Senate amendments say aye. Aye. Those opposed say nay. No. The motion prevails. The clerk will give the bill's third reading as amended by the Senate.
Third reading, House File Number 113, as amended by the Senate.
Third reading as amended by the Senate. Any further discussion? There being no further discussion, the clerk will take the roll. The clerk will close the roll. There being 80 ayes and 45 nays, the bill is repassed as amended by the Senate and its title agreed to. Motions and resolutions. There are copies of the non-controversial motions at the House desk and online. If there is no objection, we will take action on these motions first. Hearing no objection, the motions prevail. Motions and resolutions.
Moran moves that House File Number 219 be recalled from the Committee on Health and Human Services Reform and be re-referred to the Committee on Education Innovation Policy.
The lady from Ramsey, Representative Moran.
Mr. Speaker, This is a bill for act relating to human services, education, providing for a system redesign, modifying the basic sliding fee child care program, modifying eligibility for early learning, scholarships, and appropriating money. Mr. Speaker, I've spoken to both chairs, and they are good with this.
Discussion. All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion prevails.
Introduction House Resolution Number 1, House Resolution expressing the sense of the House condemning Presidential Executive Order 13769. The resolution is being referred to the Committee on Rules and Legislative Administration. That's it.
Announcements. Representative Jessup.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise on behalf of Mary Kanesh Bodine and all the freshman representatives. We invite our colleagues to a freshman reception at the Lexington restaurant located at Grand and Lexington intersection. We ask you to reserve 6:30 to 8:30 on Monday, March 13th on your calendar, and we look forward to having you join us that evening. Thank you.
Announcements. The gentleman from Rock, Chairman Schumacher.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Health and Human Service Reform Committee will be starting 15 minutes after the end of session today. Room 200. You're welcome.
Announcements. Representative Pepin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move that when the House adjourns today, it adjourns until 3:30 p.m. Monday, February 27, 2017.
Representative Pepin moves that when the House adjourns today, it adjourns until 3:30 p.m. Monday, February 27th, 2017. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. The motion prevails. Representative Pepin.
I move that the House do now adjourn.
Representative Pepin moves that the House do now adjourn. All those in favor say aye. Opposed say no. The motion prevails and the House stands adjourned until 3:30 p.m. Monday, February 27th, 2017. We are adjourned.